Uh, Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I'm just getting set up. I thought I had it right, but I just need to. There we go. Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 2019's final MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. My name is Hilary Beach. I work for the Webinar Facilitators Home Circuit. Tonight we are joined by Dr. John Webb-Ware from the University of Melbourne in the McKinnon project, and he's going to be talking to us about selecting a prime lambing date. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. There should be a control panel in the top right-hand corner of your screen that looks a little like the one, or a lot like the one that's on the slide right now. The red arrow to the top left of that control panel collapses and reinstates the control panel. So as I said, you should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. So please type your questions in the question box provided. Do so throughout the webinar. At the end of the webinar, I will be relaying the questions back to John. So please make them as succinct as possible so that we can get through them towards the end, at the end of the webinar. So just to introduce our presenter for tonight, Dr. John Webb-Ware at the University of Melbourne. John is a senior consultant with the McKinnon project at the University of Melbourne. He advises to beef and sheep producers throughout Southeast Australia on all aspects of farm management. In addition to consulting to farming businesses, he also regularly presents to farming groups and is involved with various farm management and agriculture-related committees. He also undertakes teaching of undergraduate and postgraduate veterinary and agricultural students at university. John also runs a 6,000 DSC sheep and beef property on Melbourne's fringe in partnership with his family in his spare time. So we're very lucky to be joined by John this evening, and I will just make him the presenter so we can get started.
Thanks very much, Hilary. Is that right?
I can see your presenter view there, John, if you just want to select the other screen. On your control panel.
Control panel. Which one?
So can you see the webinar control panel, so the go-to control panel?
Yeah, on the right.
Yep. Yeah, so underneath, I can't see it on your screen because it's hidden, but underneath the play button with your show screen, you should be able to select a drop-down box.
Okay. Sharing. Is that it?
No.
Can't see it.
Yeah, it's under sharing, and then
under sharing, there's
yeah.
webcam audio.
You might not be able to do it. Maybe it's only my computer. Can you swap the screens on your two screens there?
Just hold on 2 secs. I can't do anything.
So just on your presenter view there, there's that circle with the 3 dots on the screen.
So I can't even, right. Here we go. I'll do that.
Yep, so I can see your PowerPoint.
Yep, you can see it now.
Yeah, but it's not in slideshow. If that's going to be an issue for you, if not, then that's fine.
But it's wait, there's a little panel out to the side now. Is that it?
No. So if you can just work off this, can you make it a slideshow now?
Yep.
Try that.
How's that?
I see. So I can see your, so under sharing on the webinar control panel,
Yep. Under sharing. Yep.
under that show, where the pause button is, there's a screen drop down box.
Yep.
And
Okay.
you should be able to
Yep.
click on that and change your monitor
Which one to?
to whatever the opposite. It should highlight it.
Screen on monitor 2.
Try it. There you go.
How's that?
You're good to go.
We're right to go. Okay, good. Okay, bit of a glitch. Yeah, well, thanks very much, Hilary, for being able to present this evening. Look, in terms of talking about prime, I can't, now something's going on here. Here we go. Sorry, I couldn't change my screen. In terms of talking about when to set time of lambing in a prime lamb flock, and look, I must say from the outset, I'm going to be specifically talking about a first cross ewe joined to a terminal meat breed ram as the prime lamb enterprise when I talk about that. But the principles are broadly similar across the different breeds with a few variations I'll talk about. So, and I just want to go through some of the backgrounds of when to lamb in the flock, so some of the background principles and what's driving profitability, and finally modelling the system and interpreting the results. And so, in terms of the factors that we should consider, I mean, I must say there's a lot of factors which we need to consider, and they're all pretty important when we think of setting a lambing date. And I think in the background, you've always got to think stocking rate and trying to fit the pasture growth curve as much as possible. But funnily enough, with prime lambs, it's sort of, there's a few variations to that, which I'll go into in a minute, but that's certainly an important factor. Reproduction, and there's a couple of factors we need to consider there. When obviously reproduction is important in prime lamb flocks, much more so than merino flocks, particularly with higher value of meat and lamb values in recent times. So, I mean, when we talk reproduction, we need to think fecundity to start with. So the fetus is conceived to use join, and there is a very much a seasonal factor to that, which I'll talk about. And so, with particularly after Christmas, with reducing daylings, fecundity starts to improve compared to before Christmas. Merinos are the least seasonal. Crossbreds are moderately seasonal, but when you get into the British long-wool breeds, they are particularly seasonal in their breeding behaviour, such as Coopworths and the like. But obviously, with fecundity, ewe body weight is a really important factor driving that, and obviously genetics, the type of breed the animals are. But like I said, I'm going to be predominantly talking about first cross ewes here, and there's a big variation in the first cross ewe base with that. And the other part of reproduction is lamb survival, which is very much a climate thing. So, I mean, obviously lambing earlier, you're going to avoid that bad weather of late winter when temperatures are still cold, wind speed starts to increase, and it's theoretically wet. Compared to early on, it's there's not as much wind speed. The temperature's still pretty cool, and the rainfall's perhaps not as high too, but that varies with locations, and you need to consider that. But it's one thing people lamb earlier to try and avoid those high lamb losses in late winter, early spring. Nutrition's obviously an important part of that too, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much now, albeit it is important, a really important driver of reproductive performance. Another factor we've got to consider is likelihood of supplementary feeding. Now, I'm talking about the system here which we're getting rid of most of the lambs. We're not carrying over a lot of store lambs over summer. But with regard to the earlier lambing times, we're really escalating the risk of supplementary feeding in that late autumn, early winter period, and it progressively drops off as you go into winter. But again, that varies a little bit with the particular climate you're on. And so another factor which is an important consideration is what your target market is. You're just going for the heaviest lambs possible, where earlier lambing sounds better, but then you might suffer reproduction penalties and so on. And obviously, lamb price is an important part. Some people go really early to chase that higher lamb price, but are really penalised in the supplementary feeding levels for those really early lambers. So, I mean, there's a whole plethora of different issues which we need to consider. And apologies for having to skirt through these issues briefly, but it is the reality is there's a lot of factors to consider. It's part of a system, and so there's often no simple answer, but we'll have a crack at it tonight. And obviously, the final thing is fitting in with the existing management calendar and so on. There's other factors you need to consider in that lambing time as well. And look, at the end of the day, it's a complicated system. You can't go away from that, but you really need to understand these important factors. I just want to take a step back. What's driving profitability? And I've just pulled out the data from the Southwest Farm Monitor Group from last year. Now, that's the 17-18 year. The 18-19 year isn't available at the moment, but the principles are going to be exactly the same as what I'm presenting in the screen in front on slide 4. In terms of looking what's driving, this is broad livestock in general, the average and top 20% of producers based on EBIT per hectare, so per 100 mils. So in terms of the average versus the top 20% of farms, the top 20% are producing more income per hectare. Funnily enough, and that's this last year we've analysed, it's about $360 per hectare difference, and there's a bit of variation with that between years, but it's a similar sort of proportion, that difference. Enterprise costs tend to be slightly higher on the top 20% of farms because they're running higher stocking rates, and obviously that's a factor in those enterprise costs per hectare. So the gross margin per hectare is still a reflection of what the income per hectare is. Overhead costs, often not a lot of difference between the average and the top 20%. Often they're a little bit lower in the top 20%. Complements of a bit of scale efficiency there. And so the net income, ironically, it's still, that difference is still similar to the top 20%. Owner-operator allowance, not a lot of difference. Top 20% using labour more efficiently, I guess. Well, they are because more labour efficient. So you're coming down to the EBIT, earnings before interest and tax. Again, we've still got that $350-odd difference. And finance costs, again, not a lot of difference between the average and top 20%. Often the top 20% have slightly lower equity, and so incentivised to run a more efficient enterprises, but not always the case. But the bottom line, the business return, what the difference at the bottom is largely reflective of the difference at the top, which is very much driven by the production per hectare. And that sort of pattern doesn't change year in, year out. I mean, in some years, severe drought, there can be a bit of variation to that, but largely 9 out of 10 years, this pattern exists. So specifically in the lamb enterprises, and I'm looking at Southwest Victoria here, is that the gross margin per DSE for that financial year, there was very little difference between the average and the top 20%, but the gross margin per hectare was a substantial difference, and that's reflective of the difference in stocking rate, which is also a reflection of the difference in the lamb production per hectare, about 160 odd kilograms per hectare difference, even though producing similar carcass weights, and the lamb value, similar lamb value per kilogram. So not a huge difference in the sale price, per head. Lambing percentages tend to be a little bit higher in the top 20%. And these are largely crossbred new enterprises, I must say. Okay, so we'll just move on to some of the physical benchmarks on the farm. This, in the Southwest Farm Monitor Group, the average was about 18 versus the top 20%, 21. So stocking rate DSCs per hectare per 100 mils of rainfall is a lot higher. And they tend to be putting on slightly more phosphorus per hectare and other nutrients as required. But funnily enough, because they got more DSCs, the average amount of phosphorus per DSC is no different compared to the top 20% and average. Although pasture costs tend to be overall a little bit higher in the top 20%. So just moving on, just summing up that, I mean, look, at the end of the day, high profit producers tend to be running more profitable systems, which is a combination of their management, genetics, marketing, and animal health, and so on. Generally speaking, they grow more grass and also have higher pasture utilisation, and that's reflected in higher stocking rates. And importantly, part of that, they're fitting the pasture growth curve better, usually. And they, as a consequence, are producing more wool and meat per hectare, and so spreading those overhead costs and labour costs over more kilograms, and so have a lower cost of production. Okay, just a very brief background onto slide 8. How are we going to model this system, given the complexities which we need to consider? We can look at physical data over time, and there tends to be, the data we do have is probably not big enough to really hang your hat on it. But so what we need to consider is in an individual farm, the pasture quality and the production, the stocking rate, what the pasture growth curve is, and so earlier lambing, ironically, is increasing the risk because it might not fit the pasture growth curve very well. So there's a higher risk associated with feeding with that. Obviously, reproduction with the seasonality, particularly of meat sheep, is that later is often considered to have higher potential. That's certainly true, but you've got to balance that with the climate and the potential lamb losses with later lambing. That's more critical in merinos, but still an issue in prime lamb enterprise. Obviously, heavier lambs, lambing earlier, you'll achieve heavier weights and potentially higher value. But I mean, that comes at a cost of higher feeding and so on. And also, do you chase higher lamb prices outside that peak supply in spring? Well, look, for a start, I'd say, look, there's certainly opportunities to add value to lambs at the end of spring, but it's essentially a different enterprise to what I'm talking about here in terms of where you're finishing lambs out of season, whether it be on fodder crops, specialist pastures, or with opportunity feedlotting, and it's quite different. So you've got to consider this overall production system when we're talking about this, trying to work out this time of lambing. So to do that, I've used GrassGrow, which is a bioeconomic model which takes into account climate, the biology of the animal, pastures, soil types, and you can run it over a long period of time with different enterprises. And I've specifically looked at first cross ewes mated to a terminal breed to produce second cross lambs. But the principles, like I say, are similar with all prime lamb type enterprises. So in terms of, with my assumptions in setting up this the model, I've considered 3 climatic regions across southeastern Australia. So southwest Victoria down towards Hamilton, northern Victoria up close to the Murray River. So the first one's a 650 mil rainfall. Northern Victoria, it's about 550 mil rainfall, 550 to 570 mil. West slopes, northern southwest slopes around, I think I chose Young, particular site to just look at 3 distinct climatic types. I would have liked to have done table ones 1, 2, but it is different, but I guess it was partly a getting information overload. So I drew the line at three different sites. So I did actual climate data over 30 years, was inputted into the model. So that includes daily temperature, wind speed, rainfall, humidity, and everything that you need to know about the climate is in there, and the model calculates it daily. And so I've put in actual soil types for the different regions, and I've assumed a moderate to high fertility base of the pastures. And the pasture base in southwest Victoria is perennial ryegrass and annual grass and sub. The northern Victoria was phalaris, annual grass and sub, and up at Young was phalaris and annuals and sub clover. Different cultivars depending on the region of, different cultivars of sub depending on the region. And also I tried a little bit of Lucerne at Young as well for interest. I based the actual running costs, the direct costs, the enterprise, based on the Southwest Farm Monitor and long-term grain prices being sort of, I think I used about $240 for barley as our primary energy source for supplementary feeding. Purchasing 1.5-year-old first cross ewes, selling them at 7.5-year-olds. With our base model, we were assuming that lambs were going to, they'll been sold when they reached 48 kilograms, but if they didn't reach target weights by the end of the year and into early January, then they were sold regardless of the weight. Feeding ewes, when the lightest hit 2.5 condition score, 2.5, the lightest, so the average would still be over 3, supplementary feeding started. Stocking rates were set so the pasture utilisation was about 45 to 50%, avoiding pasture cover falling below about 700 kilograms. So that's a seriously bare paddock for more than 15% of the time. And excess supplementary feeding, I think once it got over about 40 kilograms, there's only a 20% probability of that. So really only a 1 in 5 year where there's a major feeding episode. So that's our base. With the time of lambing, I kept it reasonably succinct in terms of April through to September. Now, with regard to the base fecundity of our sheep, I used some pretty old data with this, but it's based on ewes being in moderate condition, not fat condition. So in April, there was more singles, as you can see them on slide 10 here. And as we go along, towards the end of the season, the number of singles drop off, but the number of twins and a few triplets increases. So that tended to, it's not what I'd regard as a really highly fecund crossbred ewe, but the outputs, what it produced, were very similar to what I'd expect in those three regions as average lambing percentages. So the later you go, you get more twins, less singles, and less actual dry sheep stock. So we're starting off at about 110% in April, and I'm not using any drugs to manipulate things like overstim to manipulate the ovulation rate for the purposes of this exercise. And by the end of it, the number of fetuses is about 155 to 160. Okay, with the later lambing. So I've used, under slide 11, I've used I've used median lamb prices for the last 5 years. So for trade lambs, 18 to 20 kilograms, 640 cents per kilogram is a 5-year median price, and pretty similar for light lambs or heavy lambs. And mutton is about 420, the median price. So I've used those prices with our surplus sheep, but I mean, the overall principles don't change a lot when I played around with a bit of a sensitivity, but I'm not reporting here. I've also factored in a monthly premium and discount. Again, this is the average premium and discount over the last 5 years. These are all adjusted for inflation. So it's really the biggest discount is in November December compared to the average price, and the highest premium is over that June, July, August period, and for the rest of over late summer and autumn, there's a slight discount on average, but some years are quite different to this pattern. This is the average over the last 5 or so years. If you look at over a 10-year period, the discount, funnily enough, is greater over October, November, and December. You start to get prices rising again, but that pattern seems to have changed, presumably with the changes in lamb supply over recent times. So this is the result. So this is the southwest Victorian one, where our average stocking rate is set at about 17.5 DSE per hectare. So essentially what's happening in April, our April lambing, they're lambed in April, and once they hit 45 kilograms, they start to sell off the lambs, and they're all sold if they don't meet weight by early January, just to fit in with the pasture growth curve. And that's essentially what I've done, the assumption with all of these production systems. So there's not a lot of lambs carried over after midsummer, which, I mean, it reflects what a lot of people do out there in the rural world. So obviously some people have different production and finishing systems in some areas, and that needs to be considered as a separate factor on top of this. So what essentially this shows, for the different lambing times, the gross income, it's actually remarkably static over the different months, and tends to drop off particularly into September. And the reason for that is we've just the lambs don't have a chance to get heavy enough, so that's more a store lamb type situation. Interestingly, obviously, as our income drops off later, but our feed costs are a lot higher with the earlier lambers. Now, one thing grass grow can't do, it can't factor in preg tox and metabolic issues. Now, metabolic issues can have it anytime, but we certainly see more preg tox with earlier lambing where the nutritional management isn't perfect. And so that's a bit of a risk, I reckon, with the earlier lambs, which isn't factored in here. Overall variable costs are higher earlier, and that's a reflection of the higher feed costs. So the gross margin per hectare, and I've highlighted in yellow the 2 highest months. And so with the similar income but higher costs, the gross margin, it starts to increase as costs go down. But interestingly, June and July seem to be the sweet spot. And that's, I mean, in my experience over the last 20 or so years, that's about where the numbers sit with regard to what we see down that time. So, I mean, I'm pretty comfortable with that area, which I know a lot about, that it's a reflection of what the reality. The later lambers, some years it's actually quite good where you've got a really late season, but what happens whilst you produce plenty of lambs, you actually, the weights drop off just because they just haven't got enough time to get heavy enough whilst pasture quality is good enough to grow. So interestingly, the variability, and that's a measure of risk, it's highest over those middle months. And that's a balance with the feed cost and the higher income, I guess. But the later lambing, the variability drops off, and that's partly a reflection of the fact that they just never have the opportunity to get too heavy. And so you can see the peak meat production in the second last row is in that, well, it's in May, June, July period. But the problem with the earlier lambing is the higher feed costs cruel it. And interestingly, the peak reproductive performance is in that middle of winter type thing. Surprisingly, it dropped off even with the higher fecundity, and I can only assume that's modelled that because of poorer weather. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it, but we see some exceptionally good lambing percentages with later lambers, with particularly out of the crossbred U-type breeds, the Cooper's and that sort of, and some of the composites which are lambing very late because some of them don't, which are seasonal, can't lamb too early. So that's Southwest Victoria. Interestingly, so this is just for Southwest Victoria. This graph, I did a variation. So this is a box plot graph, and what it actually shows. So if you look along the bottom there, there's May lambing 6 ewes per hectare or 7 ewes per hectare. So that's essentially, say, 15.5 to 17.5 DSE per hectare. And so and see how it's fairly narrow, the spread. But you can see June lambing is actually 6 and 7 ewes per hectare. So that's a higher higher production. And the solid box reflects half the 35 years I analysed, or 38 years I analysed, where the top finger is the top 25% of years, and the bottom one, bottom whisker is the bottom 25% of years, and the dots are just big outliers. So, June, July lambing, similar sort of pattern, but not quite as good overall. But there's big spread in there, and that reflects tough years, I guess, on the downside, and very good years in the upside. And I think by August, I didn't do the September one, but by August, we're just starting to miss out on getting the lambs heavy enough if we lamb too late. This comes with a caveat, I must say, for Western Victoria, is that if we just these two figures at the bottom here, look at the feed demand for ewes for the production system over the right over the monthly over the years, and with May lambing the first one and August lambing the second one, really fits in better with the pasture growth curve. But the fact of the matter is, what's actually happening with the earlier one, we're getting higher value lambs, and our feed cost isn't too high, but May is just too early. There's a big speed bump there with regard to that feed demand in early winter, so that's why we require a lot of extra feeding. So there is a bit of a caveat there, but compared to merinos, where if you're not selling off young lambs, where later lambing is always uniformly better in because it just fits in much better with the curve, and you can run higher stocking rates. But we've got this complication with the prime lambs, is trying to get enough meat production per hectare, and it's a balance with the stocking rate, the reproductive performance, and so on. Enough of southwest Victoria. Let's flick over to northeast Victoria. Now, this is up Rutherglen, Corowa type area. Might have been just over the border actually in New South Wales, but it doesn't really matter. And our stocking rate, as our optimum stocking rate, it's about 12.5 DSEs per hectare. So a pretty hefty stocking rate for the region. And I cut out later than August because the figures dropped off. But you can see, I mean, the peak income is in that May-June period, drops off in July again. And we've got a shorter growing season here. So again, it's a matter of getting the weight on the lambs by the end of spring. And feed costs steadily drop off as we go later. And the gross margin, the sweet spot, was that May-June period, and dropped off substantially into July, interestingly. So, but the variability was highest in winter as well, and that's partly high with higher gross margins, but the variation is also higher because you are exposed to season going too early. Meat production peaked at that May-June period, and lambing percentages were pretty steady May, June, July, higher than Western Victoria because the less lamb losses, I guess, but the drops off earlier just because our overall fecundity is lower. Then we jump across quickly to the southwest slopes. So we're going up to around Young, and I set a stocking rate for that particular. I'm not as familiar with that area, but in terms of the stocking rate of roughly 13.7 BSE per hectare, varied a bit with the month of lambing. But interestingly, it's pretty much flatline right across. So it's a slightly different pattern to the more southern counterparts. But the same pattern, feed costs dropped off, but they dropped off more with later. And the gross margin per hectare, the sweet spot was in that June, July period again. And that, again, reflected highest meat production per hectare. Interestingly, what I thought, well, look, I'll try a Lucerne one in the system as well. And I did it with, I'm sorry, this is just, I've just got the one stocking rate, where it's had two stocking rates for each lambing date with the first system. But so this is, I think it's 5.5 ewes per hectare, so it comes out at 13.7 DSEs per hectare. But you can see the sweet spot is in that June, possibly July period, and May's a bit worse, and August is dropping off because we're just, whilst it fits in better with the curve, pasture growth curve, it's sort of, we're missing out on too much on lamb weight. It's costing, particularly with high lamb prices. So then I've gone to a Lucerne system, and so I've included Lucerne in our Phalaris sub-annual grass pasture. It actually did change the goalpost. One thing, the feeding was slightly less right across because there's a bit more summer rain, although some would debate that obviously in the current circumstances up that part of the world, but certainly Lucerne provides a bit more to the system than it does down south. And as a consequence, it's interesting that it did change that optimum, the peak gross margin. So it was pretty much a flat line between June to August, compared with previously it dropped off by August. So with the Lucerne in the system, it enabled higher lamb production, and interestingly, it actually also benefited lambing percentages as well. So there's three snapshots. I mean, I could have gone to a lot of different areas, but I mean, in essence, there was a fairly similar pattern, even with quite different climatic zones. So, I mean, keeping this pretty short, but I mean, the right time in lambing, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's depending on all those factors I talked about. I mean, climate and pastures are really important, ewe fertility. And whilst I did this for specifically for first cross ewes, because I had solid unbiased data to populate the model. If you use other breeders, particularly where they're seasonal breeders, there's going to be more fecundity later and bigger contrast, which will swing it more to later lambing, and that might overwhelm the fecundity, might help compensate for producing lighter lambs. Feed cost is a really important thing, and it's a big negative for earlier. But with the pretty solid lamb prices at the moment, and the heavier, more lamb you can produce per hectare is a really important driver of it. And just remember, I mean, stocking rate is a really important driver of the overall factor here. But later lambing becomes more attractive with really heavy stocking rates, because the earlier system just crashes consistently and requires very, very high inputs. So, I mean, somebody who doesn't want to budge on stocking rate, they could probably go slightly earlier than ones which are heavily stocked. So there's a bit of a balancing act there. And also the production system. Sometimes, specifically, you might be better off producing store lambs. But by and large, I mean, in this system, it tended to be more profitable. But the same sort of principles will be there with merinos, although the stocking rate is a slightly more important thing there because the extra value of wool. Whereas in the prime lamb enterprise, it lends itself to where there's really good quality pastures. So overall, on balance, June and July seem to be the slightly more profitable based on gross margin per hectare. But I mean, look, and I think if we try and jump out to other types of enterprises, we need to be pretty careful. I could have spent weeks modelling different systems, but I thought I'd just keep it simple to start with. Perhaps that might be something to talk at another time. But it's certainly, I think, if we talk the prime lamb specifically, I think the principles here are certainly relevant over a lot of different areas. So I think that's all I want to speak about, Hilary. So if you want to hand over to if there's any questions, I guess.
Great, thanks so much for that, John. And I could reckon I could sit here all night and go through heaps of other systems. That was a fantastic presentation, and I think definitely a call to get you back on and maybe look through some different systems. Just to give you a bit of a break, this is our last webinar for 2019. We are still running the webinars through into 2020, so we look forward to seeing everyone in the new year. If you do have to leave early, please make sure you take the time to do the survey on when you exit the webinar. This survey provides feedback for us, Emily, and presenters like John, just to make sure that our extension efforts are hitting the right notes. So if you're ready, John, I'll just relay some questions to you. If you do have questions, please type them in the question box, and I'm going to relay them to John. So please make them as succinct as possible. The first question, John, is from Chris. He says, "Hi, John. Grassgrow only shows one feed type. At young, if you have both Lucerne and Phalaris in the system, would you think that pushes the lambing date back a little?"
Well, look, when I certainly looked at the reason I did young, because the further north and the less seasonality with rain, in other words, more over summer and autumn, the value of Lucerne really comes into its own. I know down south what the problem is that whilst Lucerne's great, there's less summer, early autumn rain, and you lose too much out of winter. So there's a real compromise there, and we can't, down in southern areas, can't get quite as much. But in essence, what it does show for if we just go back the slide to where were we? To the Lucerne, certainly there wasn't much difference in the relative gross margins for June, July, August with the Lucerne system, whereas the just straight Phalaris annual grass subsystem, the August had fallen off, not fallen off the cliff, but it wasn't as profitable. And I think it's because with the latest system, it enables you to get lambs to heavier, with the Lucerne system, enables you to get lambs to a heavier weight, which favours those lighter weight lambs.
Yeah, later lambing there. Another question, thanks John, thanks Chris. Another question from Steve. How do you think the use of grazing crops in June, July in mixed cropping livestock farms would affect the result?
Yeah, good question. And it's an interesting one, this, because, and I'd relate it to another one, which I reckon, I mean, obviously, I mean, you've got to, I mean, where you can not compromise your crop yields too much, it's enabling you to go perhaps a little bit earlier, or another one, it might be finishing late lambs. Both of those systems could work. I haven't specifically modelled it, and it would be tricky to do it in grass grow. You'd almost have to take the raw data out and then model it separately, because in essence, I don't think the fundamental principles will change, but what it does often enable is higher stocking rates to be run over the year, if that's a feed limiting time. The other thing we're seeing too is that whilst traditionally we used to rate winter as the most feed limiting time, producers which have successfully put quite a lot of land into winter active Phalarises are really finding, and particularly with tactical use of nitrogen and gibberellic acid on top. I mean, winter is no longer that feed limiting time at all. It's really driven back to that autumn period before the autumn break, and winter is a lot, and that enables higher stocking rates to be run, but it also might justify slightly earlier lambing. But I want to be really careful with that. I'm a big fan of not going too early, believe me, because I think the risks of feeding, and I think you really feel it, and in those really tough years with late autumn breaks with regard to the stress on the sheep and so on. So, yeah, for the prime lamb enterprises, yeah, I think it's got merit in there. But to me, I'd be looking at, one is there ways we can do extra finishing of stock, and I've seen some people do that very successfully with those winter crops, but doesn't enable additional stocking rate to be run because it takes away that winter feed gap. So yeah, no, good point. Haven't got all the answers, but I think the principles are what you're saying. It will improve, drive extra stocking rate.
Thanks, John. Yeah, as you said, there's already so many variables that go into it. So thanks for that.
Yeah, look, I would have loved to have. I started thinking of all these things, but I said no, I'll never get the modelling finished. So.
Just another question from Mel. Would you recommend using Regulin to increase ovulation rates?
Look, Regulin's particularly a chemical melatonin to induce. One is to reduce the number of dries from early joining, and what I'm talking about before Christmas, where Regulin's got real value. So yeah, I've always been wary about chasing Regulin because it's starting to get a bit too early from my comfort with the risk profile. But with really high lamb prices, the value proposition for Regulin improves. So I think, yeah, with high lamb prices, there's definitely more value proposition. I've always been one, well, to have a look at that. Well, if you're going really early, are you better off just slightly later, not have to use Regulin, so joining after Christmas, not have to use Regulin and maximise your lamb production per hectare without the extra expense. I'm not quite sure. I haven't checked on price, but it used to be about $6 a ewe. So but there was a proposition there for those early lambers to use it. But my comment is if that's the right system. Different thing with overstim, that can be used at any time if the fecundity of your ewes is not fantastic in a prime lamb at a price. There is a value there, but it's important to keep, all very well using some of these products, but it's critical to keep the extra fetuses alive, otherwise you've done your money.
Yeah, so getting your system right first. So another question from John, interested in the lower lambing percentage in September. I live in Tassie and would think it would be highest in September. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I saw that and it did surprise me that it dropped off. I did it, and look, it wasn't that they were getting. It did drop off a little bit more than what I would have thought. Now, it just might be the particular site I used in Western Victoria. It was really exposed to the wind, perhaps, because whilst the data input with the fetuses was as high as any month, with September, I was surprised how much it dropped off. But interestingly, you note up at young, that wasn't the case. You got the higher lambing, it got better lambing percentage because the weather is kinder. You don't have the wind speed that southwest Victoria. I was surprised it dropped off to that. And in my experience, it doesn't usually drop off. It wasn't a huge drop off, but it was still a reasonable drop off all the same. But although when I look at the actual average results in the June, July, they're smack on average for the actual lambing percentages we do see in Western Victoria. So they were very real. I was a little bit surprised with the late, but even if we included a higher lambing percentage with that September lambing, we would have still missed out there because the season you would have still missed out because the lambs wouldn't have been heavy enough by the end of spring. Okay, so I think for the composite, not so much composite, but some of the Coopworthy type flocks, those type of breeds where they've got a much bigger response with later lambing, where they may come into their own. But I just didn't include that data because I had much missed. I haven't got the monthly fecundity data where as a base level to compare every month. I'm actually working on that with a particular producer to actually be able to model that with some degree of confidence, or where they've got really good long-term data with a whole plethora of different lambing times. Because you've got to remember those sort of numbers I was putting in there were base numbers for a particular fertility rate, and it might be with your Tasmanian scenario that the ewes in April are much heavier, and so their fecundity is higher. Like I said, I started feeding when the lightest ewes got down to condition score 2.5. And that would regularly happen in, so it still means that the average is above 3, but it might mean if some people will feed them heavier than that, so get higher reproductive performance than what I modelled here. And that needs to be taken into account when you read this data at face value. But I think I was trying to reflect what the realistic average sort of scenario is, and you could add all those variables on top of it. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Certainly a highly variable between flock, that lambing percentage, so something to take into account there. Question from Tom Winnie. Do you think maternal composite joining in early February is okay in regards to their seasonality in southwest Victoria?
Good question. I reckon, look, some composites, it's not an issue at all. Other composites it is. So it would depend on the background of the composites. And look, they're definitely variable. Some composites I've seen it's not a problem lambing in early February. Not a problem at all. But some of the British long wool breeds, if there's a lot of that in their background, you just need to be a little bit careful because they are more exposed to that seasonality if you go too early. But in my experience with some of the composites, it's been okay. But I mean, without complicating the issue here, unfortunately, I didn't do every type of system. But my approach to that, I'd speak to the seed stock producer where you're getting your rams from, and often they will have some reasonable data, depending on the seed stock producer, of what the differences are, but with the particular breed, and so that's probably the first place it'd go. Some of them will have that information, some of them won't have that information, but a little bit more homework, I'd say, first before answering that completely. But I've certainly seen some go there without any problems at all, but it would worry me with others. Okay.
Great, thanks, John. Last question, if anyone has anything else to get in, do so quickly. From Joe, what average daily weight gain in the lamb for the lambs was used in the model?
Look, I would have to go back to the particular model, but I mean, look, at the end of the day, a lot of the lambs were getting off at 48 kilograms, except for the really late lambers. So, say for the July, a lot of them were going by once they hit 48 kilograms. So if we work backwards, 48 less 5 kilogram birth weight. So let's say 43 kilos divided by if we had 4 months, so 120 days. Sorry, I'm just going on the run here because I just can't remember that off the top of my head in grass grow, but 43 divided by 120 equals, so about 300 to 350 grams a day. Okay. But the later ones, what really misses out once your pasture quality declines in December, your weight gain really falls off a cliff quite quickly. So they just stop putting on weight as soon as those pastures senesce, and that's, you just haven't got the time with the later lambers to get them up to the heavy weights. And look, you can do it other ways with fodder crops, and that's what a lot of people do, and that works really well, particularly with pasture improvement as well. But again, I didn't want to complicate the system at the base level, but they need to be considered as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. Just another one's coming from David. As we move north from southwest of Victoria, what general recommendation can you make before we reach the generally wetter northeast of Victoria?
Well, look, in terms of time of lambing, I presume we're talking to them.
Yes.
Look, it seemed like there wasn't a lot of difference.
No.
That sort of, I think, as the June, July, down south, slightly favouring the June. Up in northern Victoria, as you go further north into drier areas, I think it just creeps back. The July becomes a bit more wobbly back into favouring June, would be my comment.
Great. All right, that seems to be all for tonight, everyone. Thank you very much, John, for answering those questions. Great questions tonight, guys. Thank you for your engagement in 2019. We look forward to continuing on with the webinar series into 2020. I wish you everyone a happy Christmas and a fantastic new year. Thanks so much, John, for your input tonight.
Thanks very much, Hilary. Pleasure.